Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. And my question for you is, the social and economic empowerment of women and girls is key to reducing climate change. In your opinion, how can African leaders ensure a just and gender responsive transition to a green economy in Africa?
Before I actually answer the question, just to give a little context around climate change and the broader conversation of economic empowerment, the discourse has increasingly, been woven into broader conversations around economic development, not only because the effects of climate change can jeopardize the progress that is being made by development, but also action on mitigation and adaptation to climate has severe impacts and also opportunities for developing countries. Now, the opportunities that I talked about in developing countries and climate change are rarely mentioned within the gender context, and in general within the framework of empowering women. I think in most cases, when we talk about addressing climate change, women have been viewed as recipients of the vulnerability and the impacts of climate change in general, rather than as being seen as active stakeholders that can deliver solutions. This is not something that's new. I think we've seen that women have had to deal with many of these challenges in different aspects of life when it comes to health, when it comes to trade, and climate change is just one other area that we're seeing this materialize. The linkages between climate change and gender are clear. By default, that poor social groups in general bear the brunt of the impacts of climate change, and women are no exception to this. We know that the global poor make up more than 50% of women, and studies within this sector have also shown that women and children are 14 times more likely to lose their lives, for example, in a natural disaster. And we know that the impacts of climate change results in many of these natural disasters, like flooding, like droughts, heat waves, that have these impacts on women. So just to set that context, we have seen that women are really struggling when it comes to climate change, but also stand to be one of the biggest assets we have in addressing climate change. I was just listening to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres speak about changing this dynamic. And I think one of the fundamental pillars in accelerating a green transition, particularly on the African continent, is looking at how we change some of the gender power balances. And I think that is going to be one of the core things to change when we talk about empowering women, particularly when it comes to addressing climate. I'm just going to highlight a few things in answering the question. I think the first pillar to really address is access to education. Education is key. For women, they will need to understand their impacts and dependencies on climate change. We know in many parts of Africa, women are seen as the stakeholders that provide food, nutrition for their families. This makes them depend on resources such as land, water, and there is a really good book by the former Prime Minister of Ireland, Mary Robinson, which highlights some of the issues women have to deal with in increasingly trying to feed for their families. So just giving women an understanding of the impacts of climate change on their lives will be a place to start to set the baseline. So the women are having that increased awareness. Secondly, I think from understanding, they will need to also understand the potential solutions that are available for them to deliver. We know that there are several women that are at the forefront on, for example, conservation, on agriculture, and we need to be able to help them to leverage the different tools, methodologies, and innovative sort of solutions within these different sectors to really take advantage of their actions on climate. In many cases, we also see that women who, usually, like I said, depend on these resources have no ownership rights to some of these resources and some of the productive resources that will actually help address climate change. So the second most important thing that I think government should prioritize is access to and control over some of these productive resources. So giving women the opportunity to own land and be able to use it in a way that they see fit to either mitigate the climate change or also to help speed up some of the solutions in adaptation. I think the third piece is around access to services. I mentioned earlier that many of these women's issues are intertwined with issues of health, right? And other SDGs. So I think particularly when we look at access to services like medical care, childcare services, these will be able to free up some of the time that women have to focus on the solutions that they're providing in climate, but also to be able to monetize some of these solutions in a way that actually empowers them. Secondly, access to services mean access to some of, for example, agricultural extension services, which have predominantly been provided to larger agricultural organizations driven mostly by men. I think we need to make some of this information and services available to women and smallholder farmers who are able to also then leverage that service in driving more climate-friendly solutions, but also drive economic improvement and empowerment within the women's society. A very critical piece in accelerating the transition to a green economy in general, and particularly for women, is around access to finance and markets. I think governments will have to increasingly reduce the barrier of entry, particularly for women in, for example, access to loans and funds. I mentioned that women across the continent, and I can name examples from Tanzania, all the way to areas such as Ghana, women are really leading efforts on natural resource conservation. However, we have seen a trend that not many of these women are benefiting financially from access to funds, access to loans, but also some of the access to international climate funding, such as the Clean Development Mechanism under the UNFCCC and the REDD+ programs, which awards finance to some of these initiatives. So I think there has to be a lot more concerted effort from governments to make sure that there is an allocation for women who are participating in these things. Within the same point around finance, I think finance access to markets will also be really important. We know that many of the climate-related services, such as agriculture, but also energy, are currently very male-dominant. So you have a significant portion of these markets dominated by males, where women are giving usually relatively minor roles. I think this will need to change. Again, the barrier to entry for these women that want to take action, innovate in renewable energy, and provide alternative low energy solutions will need to be given the right incentives to be able to take action. The fifth point that I would like to make is around drawing benefits from the deployment of public funds. We know that in the broader conversation of a green growth economy, the governments across the continent have started rolling out development plans, looking at renewable energy, roads, and other social amenities to really accelerate that transition. We need to ensure that women in particular have access to some of these services. For example, connecting rural areas to renewable energy grids. I think this is one of the solutions that will have major co-benefits in the sense that it provides fundamental services to the rural areas, but particularly women who have to undertake very laborious tasks at home that usually take a lot of time can leverage the power of energy to shorten that time that they need to do domestic chores, and can leverage that in taking other economic activities to contribute to the family, but to also empower themselves. The last thing, which I think sums all of this these points together is around increasing participation of women across all spheres of climate change policy and advocacy. And with this, I think we need to ensure that women are not only seen as recipients and vulnerable to climate change, but they are also seen as very valuable contributors. I think over the years, we've seen so many women join in the climate conversations, and looking internationally, I think we have very prominent women such as Patricia Espinosa, who's the Executive Secretary for the UNFCCC, women like Christiana Figueres, who were very instrumental in delivering the Paris Agreement itself, but bringing it to national and subnational levels. We have very prominent women also cropping up on the continent in advocacy at different levels. And I think we need to make sure that there is meaningful engagement with all of these women who have valuable insights in design, planning, and implementation of climate actions. So in a nutshell, those are some of the top things that I think will need to be prioritized. 1, education. 2, access and control over productive resources such as land, access to services, access to finance, drawing from some of the public funds. And I think lastly, an overall integration of women into action and advocacy on climate change.